From a colonial outpost that was struggling with famine to one of the fastest-growing major economies on the planet. The story of India's economic transformation is, without a doubt, one of the most remarkable of the last century. So, how did it happen? What were the key turning points? And what were the massive challenges along the way? All right, let's get into it.
So here's how we're going to break this incredible story down. We're going to start with the one problem that drives literally every economy. Then, we'll look at the tough hand India was dealt at independence. We'll explore how it forged a completely new path, understand the game-changing shift in 1991, and then finally, we'll take a hard look at where the economy stands today.
To really get a grip on any economy, we have to start with a question that everyone, and I mean everyone, from a world leader to a local shopkeeper, has to deal with every single day.
It seems almost like a childish question, doesn't it? Why can't we just have unlimited food, perfect roads everywhere, endless clean energy, you name it? Well, the answer to that simple question is the absolute bedrock of all economics.
And the answer is just one word, but it's an incredibly powerful one: scarcity. See, we have limited resources, things like land, money, labor, even time. But our wants, our desires are practically infinite. And that fundamental conflict right there forces every single society to make some really tough choices. And that one problem creates this huge chain reaction. Because of scarcity, we're forced to decide three basic things. What do we produce? How do we produce it? And for whom do we produce it? Think about it. Does a country spend its limited budget on building more hospitals or on buying more fighter jets? That tension, that unavoidable choice, is really what economics is all about. Okay, so keeping that big idea in our back pocket, let's rewind the clock to 1947. What was the economic reality for a brand new, independent India? What scarce resources did it actually have? And what monumental needs was it staring down? While the economy India inherited was basically set up to serve another nation, British policies had pretty systematically turned India into a supplier of cheap raw materials for British factories, and at the same time made it a captive market for British finished goods. India's own industrial potential was stifled, and its agriculture was just stuck in a rut of low productivity.
And the human cost of this economic stagnation was just staggering. Take a look at this number, 218. That was the infant mortality rate. Let that sink in. It means for every 1,000 babies born, almost a quarter of them wouldn't survive to see their first birthday. It is a truly devastating figure that tells you everything about the conditions back then.
In this table here, it paints an even wider, grimmer picture. Life expectancy was just 44 years. Less than 16% of the population could read or write. And for women, it was a shocking 7%. These weren't just numbers on a page. These were the colossal mountains the new nation had to start climbing from day one. So, faced with this absolutely brutal inheritance, how did India's new leaders decide to tackle this problem of scarcity and development? What was their master plan? The answer was what's called a mixed economy. So it wasn't purely capitalist and it wasn't purely socialist, it was a blend. The idea was that the government, the state, would play a huge role in planning and guiding the economy, but private businesses would also exist and operate alongside it. And the main tool for this grand vision was the 5-year plan, a detailed blueprint for the country's development. Now, with so many needs and so few resources, India's planners laid out 4 big goals. First, just pure growth, making the economic pie bigger for everyone. Second was modernization, which wasn't just about new factories and dams, but also about changing social views, like promoting equal rights for women. Third, and this was crucial, was self-reliance. The idea was to avoid being dependent on other nations. And finally, equity, making sure that growth wasn't just for the wealthy, but that its benefits actually reached the poorest people. That goal of self-reliance, it ran smack into its biggest test when it came to food. A nation that can't feed its own people is always going to be vulnerable. This absolute urgency for food security is what sparked one of the biggest transformations in India's entire history. And that was the Green Revolution. It wasn't just one magic bullet, but a whole package of new methods. Farmers got access to high-yielding variety seeds for wheat and rice, but, and this is key, those seeds needed a whole support system: reliable irrigation, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides to work their magic. It started in states like Punjab and Andhra Pradesh, and the result was incredible. Food production skyrocketed, and India, for the first time, became self-sufficient in food grains. All right, let's fast forward to our next pivotal moment, 1991. The state-led model had certainly had its successes, but by the late 1980s, it was starting to show some serious cracks. A crisis was brewing, and it was about to change India's economy forever.
By 1991, India was literally on the verge of economic collapse. Its foreign exchange reserves, which is basically the money a country needs to pay for imports like oil, had shrunk to almost nothing. We're talking enough for maybe a few weeks of imports. The country was caught in a debt trap, and the old economic model just wasn't working anymore. Something radical had to be done, and it had to be done fast.
So the response came in the form of three big ideas, famously known today as the LPG reforms. L for liberalization. This meant tearing down the jungle of government licenses and controls and freeing up businesses to actually do business. P for privatization. This meant shrinking the role of government-owned companies and giving the private sector a much bigger field to play on. And G for globalization. This was about opening India's doors to the world, to foreign trade and investment.
And wow, did these reforms have an impact. The change was immediate and just dramatic. Just look at the foreign exchange reserves. Right before the crisis in 1991, India had about $6 billion. By 2018, that number had exploded to over $413 billion. This kind of financial stability was a direct result of opening up the economy.
And here's a perfect example of what that globalization actually looked like on the ground. In 1995, the American car giant Ford Motors came to India and invested a huge amount to set up a plant. Just a couple of decades later, it wasn't just selling cars in India, it was exporting almost 200,000 cars a year from India to the rest of the world. That's what integrating with the global economy really means.
So all of this brings us to today. After decades of central planning, followed by 3 decades of free market reforms, what's the final report card? What has this incredible journey achieved, and what are the big challenges that are still left to tackle?
Well, in terms of pure size, the growth is just undeniable. Now, this chart shows something called GDP at PPP. All that means is it's a way to compare economies based on what their money can actually buy at home. And by that measure, India's economy is now the 3rd largest in the world, completely dwarfing its neighbor Pakistan. But, that comparison with China also shows you just how far there is still to go. India's economy is still less than half the size of China's. And that's really the crucial point here. The story is complicated. It's two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, you've got incredible GDP growth, a booming service sector, and tons of foreign investment. But on the flip side, that growth hasn't created enough jobs, many in agriculture are still struggling, and the gap between the rich and the poor has gotten wider. The progress is absolutely real, but so are the problems.
And that leads to maybe the biggest question of all. Is this kind of growth sustainable? Because this rapid development has come at a huge environmental cost. For example, that same agricultural boom from the Green Revolution that fed the nation is now causing a crisis for its most precious resource, water. This isn't some problem for the distant future. It's happening right now.
I think this quote really just captures the final massive challenge perfectly. India's economic journey has been all about overcoming scarcity to meet the needs of people living today. But the ultimate test, the real challenge for the next chapter, is whether it can keep doing that without taking away the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that right there is the defining question for India's future.